It's time to go beyond the headlines, cause I don't put in overtime just so I can headline. Okay, now it's Fox Sports, I'm live with Renee. Going hard every day, sports rapping every play. Different segments for your favorites, coming at you daily with positive vibes, yeah, we some game changers. Basketball, football, soccer, with different interviews, you never know who may pop up. Listen, only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington.
Joining us here on Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington, we've got Maya Washington from Minnesota joining us, a multi-hyphenated artist, an actress, a writer, a poet. You do it all. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you today.
I am excited to have you here to talk about your career and all that you have been able to accomplish. Before we even get into that, there's a lot going on in our country right now around COVID-19, around the Black Lives Matter movement. You're in Minnesota. I need to ask, what is your new normal like, and how has all this affected your world as you know it?
Well, I think in addition to just this isolation, right, that we've all fallen in line around with COVID-19, and especially in Black communities, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, obviously the impact of COVID-19 has been severe, and the extent to which it's impacted our elders is very concerning. And so my family and I have been taking very serious, extreme precautions with that, and doing our best to stay safe, stay healthy. With the major social civil rights movement that was sparked here just not even 2 weeks ago. It's an exciting time. It's a painful time for people in Minnesota, for our Black community, for the Indigenous community, for the immigrant community, and other communities of color who were disproportionately harmed and affected in a lot of ways by the burning of their community centers and community organizations, grocery stores, post offices. A lot of these things were very painful to see. Something that was the catalyst for a major shift in our consciousness has also come at a real cost to our community. So it's new normal. I don't think there is a new normal, but I do feel on the ground here in the Twin Cities that there is a sense that change is happening, it is coming, and we will not settle for the old version of normal, that there has to be real systemic change here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you bring up, is the fact that a lot of people feel like once the pandemic is over and once the protests are over, we're just going to return back to life as we knew it before. But no, as you mentioned, this is the way that the world is shifting. This is the way all of our lives are going to be changing, hopefully for the better. It seems like as of now, I'm optimistic it is for the better, that it's time for change, in all aspects of our lives. The way that our society is perceives different races, racism in itself, social injustice, all of this is going to change. As well as our careers, of course, because we're not going to be able to go back to life as we know it in that aspect either. So for you as a filmmaker, as a producer, as a writer, as you have worked in so many different areas, but I have to go back before you even get into your career now. And I'm curious to know the influence of your dad, Gene Washington, a four-time Pro Bowler, NFL player, growing up, watching all of his success and all that he went through on the field. I'm curious to know how much that influenced you as a kid growing up, and having him as a role model and as as a father, and how that influenced your life.
Well, I think what's really telling about my dad's accomplishments in sports and this time that we're in now is that I wasn't born yet. My dad was playing in the late 60s, early 70s. I wasn't, a twinkle in anyone's eye yet. I have two older sisters who were little girls during that time. So when I was growing up, my dad was a guy who put on a suit and went to work in an office, and most of his career that I witnessed as a child was around getting people access to jobs, employment, educational resources, specifically in the engineering space. So my dad was on the forefront of seeing organizations like NSBE take form and flourish, SHIP, Mashimba, ACES, NACME, you know, a lot of inroads, a lot of these important organizations that were doing the work of getting people of color opportunities where they had been previously left out of the system. That was always very inspirational to me because it showed me a sense of what my responsibility is, not just for myself and gaining opportunities for me, but for finding those opportunities for other people. And so how it connects to the time that we're in and the extent to which people, especially Black people, we have always felt the knee on our neck, to take from Al Sharpton's words during the George Floyd Memorial. We felt that knee on our neck, but to now understand the systemic, the history. What's interesting about my dad and my relationship to his career, it wasn't until I started working on Through the Banks of the Red Cedar that I came to understand that he was on the first fully integrated college football team at Michigan State. I knew he grew up in segregation. I knew what his scholarship to Michigan State meant to him, but it really wasn't until 2011, after Bubba Smith, Police Academy movies, Bubba Smith passed away in 2011, and my dad gave a press interview and started to talk about the ways that Bubba Smith's family helped him get to Michigan State. And underneath that was an incredible pipeline story, an incredible underground railroad of college football is what the sports historians have called this unique thing my dad was a part of. And that extends to when he was drafted to the Minnesota Vikings in 1967, learning about the racism that he and his teammates faced, just trying to go play a game in the South. The United States was still very much segregated all throughout my dad's pro career, which went on until about the 1975 season.
Oh, yes. And that is, I'm so glad you bring that up because, you know, the influence of a parent might not be seen until later on, you know, like as you talk about, it wasn't until you were working with your dad on through, you know, on the film side of things that you really had the opportunity to see, okay, this is all that my dad has been able to accomplish. This is what he brings to society. It's more than just being more than an athlete, as we hear often, you know, more than just being an NFL player, but with working on Through the Banks of the Red Cedar on your dad and telling his story, I have to think that your inspiration came in the sense of filmmaking as well. You know, your work as a dancer, as a, you know, working in theater, working in acting, filmmaking, and directing, which your dad has also worked in as well, but also even be able to tell his story in that light. You know, that's the influence. And that's something that is incredible because as you talk about, unfortunately, the cycle's repeated itself. And here we are back again in the midst of a civil rights protest, but it is still prevalent today. And it is still something that we're working through as we talk about each generation still dealing with the same fight. And as we're fighting for change so that the next generation does not. So having the opportunity to work with your dad, I want to get more into Through the Banks of the Red Cedar and working with your dad on that aspect, and even just your filmmaking career as a whole, what you look to bring in all your work that you're bringing in your storytelling, because we're both storytellers just in a different platform. So I'm definitely curious to know about that aspect as well.
Well, for me, it really starts with illuminating the stories that are often unseen or unheard or underexplored. And that really came from having a background as a dancer first, then an actor and working in musical theater, and finding that the opportunities for me were few and far between in terms of casting, right? Because if you have a framework in the American theater that preferences white people, white stories, white playwrights, your opportunities as a Black actress are limited to whatever those stages are producing at the time, and then vying for those opportunities with other amazingly talented Black women who are also looking for roles. So that lent itself often to getting the opportunity to do important literature by Black writers, but also being cast ethnically ambiguous
Mm,
or being cast colorblind casting, right? Where you have a family where everyone in the family is, you know, biologically related, but we don't address the fact that we're all a different ethnicity, you know,
yes.
these kinds of experiments that I participated in, you know, because it's my craft, because I needed work sort of at the earlier part of this century. And I got to a point where I was like, this is not it. There's got to be a better way. And there are too many important stories, and there's just too much
Mm-hmm.
that we contribute as women and as people of color, that we shouldn't have to be only working on these films or taking these roles that don't really get at the heart of what my voice wants to share. And
Mm-hmm.
my voice wants to tell the stories of Black resilience. My voice wants to tell the stories of anyone who has found a way through difficult circumstances, who's been an underdog, find a way to tell those stories. So Through the Banks of the Red Cedar is about my dad's journey. It's a father-daughter story. And so it explores a lot of things that I find that all people tend to relate to, but it especially means a lot to Black women in our relationships with our fathers, and sort of the Black family in and of itself, in addition to sports. My
Mm-hmm.
first narrative short film, White Space, is about a deaf performance poet performing for
Mm-hmm.
a hearing audience for the first time. The whole purpose around that film was to bring awareness to the hearing community, to think about how are we including and excluding not just the deaf community, but people with disabilities broadly in the major conversations around art and how we experience art. My other narrative short film, which is also has been doing the round since 2018, is called Clear. And it's a reentry story that centers a mixed race, Indigenous, African American, Native American family who's grappling with the aftermath of wrongful conviction. It's a, what do you do on that first day home? How does this family piece its life
Mm-hmm.
together? So there is a through line through everything that I do that centers stories and people who have had to exist on the margins of American society, of life in the United States, because I'm frankly exhausted by the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we are not hearing these stories, but also it gives me an opportunity to create platforms and spaces for talented actors and talented cinematographers and other people who are part of that process.
Well, first of all, let me just clarify your award-winning short film White Space. Don't discredit that. You are an award-winning filmmaker. But I think one of the most incredible, and congratulations on that, one of the most incredible things that you talk about is you're sharing stories, much like this is partly why I wanted to interview you. You work the same way, and the way you work and tell stories is very similar to what I look to do as a reporter, telling stories that are a little deeper. You know, everyone knows your dad as the Vikings legend, but they may not know about his experiences with Michigan State, or even talking about your narrative short film Clear, the process of working back into society. You know, your film with White Space, everything that you're doing brings out another aspect of life, of reality, that a lot of people may not often see or know about. You know, we only in this world, because we're so shallow around social media, and I say that in the most respectful way possible, we only see what we want to see. We only see the likes, the followers, whatever is being put on social media, whatever's being put out there. We don't really pay attention to or care to pay attention to what's going on a little bit deeper. So in your storytelling, in your films, you know, as a creative, you're bringing out those storylines. You've been through a lot, and you're trying to show, okay, there's more to being, whether it's a Vikings legend in your dad, or being, you know, someone that was in prison. So I'm definitely curious, because you touched on this briefly, with the things you've dealt with in your career, in terms of looking for roles and sacrifices you had to make, you know, how that transition to maybe motivate you even more. You know, you talk about being an actor in your own experiences, how it was difficult to get those roles. It was difficult to, you know, as a Black woman, the experience with that. So I'm definitely curious to know, now that you are the one making decisions, you're, you know, you're the one that's behind the creativity of the films and of the narrative. You're controlling the narrative. you know, how much did that actually motivate you even more to make sure that you were giving opportunities and telling these stories versus maybe even when you got started? I don't know if you always had that motivation or maybe it was pulled out even more because of your experiences.
Well, I think I've always been interested. Luckily, as a teenager, is kind of when my career as an actor started. I did a play called Freedom Writers at Youth Performance Company in the Twin Cities, and it follows the Freedom Summer of 1964. And I got to play a civil rights worker, a SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee member who traveled to Mississippi to help people register to vote during that Freedom Summer. And so to be, I don't know how old I was, maybe 15 or 16, and dramatize those events and in my body understand that I'm the same age as some of the brave young people who made it so that we have the platforms that we have today, that we have a lot of the freedoms. Doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go, but that planted a seed in me and in my heart that art could be used for social change, because by dramatizing those events for audiences, we had a pretty rigorous schedule. I would say it's almost like what I experienced once I became a professional, where we had, I think, 6 to 8 shows a week. And we got to meet some of the original freedom writers who are still living in the Twin Cities. I got to see firsthand how telling stories about social change, social justice, how transformative that can be. So much so that when I graduated from high school, one of my white friends came up to me and he said, "Maya, I'm so glad I saw your," I don't know why I'm making this accent. I don't know that he talked like this, but that's the energy it felt like. "Maya, I'm so glad I saw your play because there was a question about the civil rights movement on the AP test and it helped me take my test," or whatever. And good for him. You know, he went on and did whatever he did with his life. But that really was the catalyst for me to understand always as an artist that there is an ability to cause an emotional shift in someone's heart and in their psyche when you can bring a story alive in an artful manner that's a little different than me just standing up and giving a lecture about what happened, not just in 1964, but in my dad's life or any other part of that. And so what I try to do is tell stories across platforms. So in addition to all of these films existing in film form, there's a poetry anthology that goes along with White Space. It's called White Space Poetry Anthology, and it features work from deaf and hearing poets all on the same place in space. And we do, at that time, around 2011 to 2014, live poetry events, arts residencies, and always sort of have this relationship to where you're visually seeing an ASL interpreter, often a deaf interpreter, and a hearing artist sharing the stage together. Sharing the stage together, sharing the page together with Clear. We're working on some hopeful and exciting things with Innocence Project in Northern California to figure out how to get the film out in other places and spaces to create advocacy and a social change and a shift in consciousness and educate people. And with Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, I'm also writing a memoir at the moment. And we've done public art. We have large scale images of my dad, Carl Eller. We also have Alan Page on the side of a major building in the Twin Cities that we were able to do this beautiful exhibit that was up for maybe about 6 months throughout the time that the Super Bowl was here in Minnesota and beyond. So I'm fueled by this deep desire to see social change, to fight for the underdog, and recognize that the arts in all the different forms that we can receive a story, including what you do as a journalist. There are so many ways that we can deliver this important information in hopes that, I think, at the core of the challenges of white supremacist framework that excludes and effectively harms everyone, not just not just the people who do not fit into sort of the ideals of that framework. But in order for that to shift, if you don't see me as a human being, if you don't see a person who is deaf, or someone who has a disability, or someone who is queer, someone who has any number of differences because of where they were from, where they were born, how they worship, all of these issues that we all have in common as groups that have been marginalized. If you can't respect our humanity, if you can't have a deep compassion and empathy, a lot of the problems that we see in our culture, and especially in the United States, won't go away.
Exactly.
Because people are just fighting to breathe, fighting to be seen as human.
Well, first of all, I will say I could not agree more. And I think that's now is the time more than ever where people have to speak up and use their platforms, whether it's through me as a reporter or you as a filmmaker, to use our platforms to change the narrative, to have the opportunity to be open about these concepts and open about what is reality that we're living as a minority. And that doesn't even mean just race, as you touch on. It could be who you're choosing to love. It could be if you have, any hearing impairments or anything that you're dealing with that puts you in the minority and in that marginalized group in terms of how people perceive you because you may look different. But at the end of the day, we're all human. We're all just trying to do our best in this world. So it is very refreshing and encouraging to hear you talk about how you're using your platform. And ironically, I guess you read my mind in a sense. I don't know if it's the Washington connection, because I was literally going to ask what is next for you and what you're working on. And so as you were getting to, I was like, oh my goodness, like you actually took the words right out of my mouth. That was my next question. So I will then ask you, where can people follow to keep up with what's next as you continue to take your filmmaking and even in terms of poetry and the different areas that you're trying to connect with in terms of your audience, ASL, all these different things you're bringing to the forefront, which are tremendous. Where can people follow to continue to keep up with you on your journey?
Well, on Twitter and Instagram, I'm Maya Washington, like iPhone, but Maya Washington on Twitter and Instagram. And the film Through the Banks of the Red Cedar is throughthebanksoftheredcedar.com. If that's a lot of words, it was inspired by the Michigan State fight song that starts on the banks of the Red Cedar. So through the banks of the Red Cedar. But if that is just confusing, you can also find us at redcedarmovie.com, or you can Google Gene Washington Red Cedar or movie, and you'll probably find us with white space. It's available on my website, the full film. It's also available on Quelly TV, and I just want to plug that resource because Black woman Deshauna Spencer actually started her own streaming platform with amazing content by Black creators called Quelly TV, and I think she's recently did a deal with Comcast, and it's just probably a matter of figuring some things out to see how you can get on that platform. But my personal website is themayawashington.com. THEMAYA Washington, like Renee Washington. .com.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I don't know why, it's very childish, but every time someone has the same last name as me, I'm like, we're family, we're related. Like, it just makes it that much more special. And it is ironic that you and I operate in the same way. It is the Washington connection. So I am so thankful. Oh yeah. I'm so thankful that you were able to join the show for our Positive Vibes Only segment to talk about all the great things you're doing, to be a trailblazer, to tell these stories, and to really connect with people in a way that, especially now, is needed. So thank you so much for being on the show this week. I really appreciate you, and I'm excited to see what's next as you talk about, this is just the beginning. I'm sure we're going to continue to see great things, and I'm excited to see as your films and everything continue to take off, watching you progress. So thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you, Renee.